Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Saturday, September the 12th, 2020. There are now 52 voting days left until the November 3rd general election. But on this episode of the Politicrat, for those of you who were not able to be a part of the Zoom chat that I hosted last month on August the 7th, 2020, an opportunity for you to hear that entire chat in full on this episode. I conversed and spoke about the Raoul Peck documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, as part of the Mechanics Institute's film series in August, Black Lives in Film, here in San Francisco, California. My conversation and hosting this event was to a predominantly white audience, and here in the Bay Area, in San Francisco and beyond, for at least 50 participants, more than that, certainly about 53 participants, during the hour-plus long chat. You will likely find this to be quite interesting to listen to. So I hope that you join me as the chat unfolded on August the 7th, 2020, talking about James Baldwin, the documentary that features him called I Am Not Your Negro, directed by Raoul Peck, and a conversation and dialogue around racism and about whiteness and white people and what their responsibilities are regarding ending racism in the United States of America. That audio of last month's conversation is coming up next. I hosted a conversation about the documentary I Am Not Your Negro, directed by Raoul Peck, about human rights in the United States, systemic racism against black people, and the responsibility of white people to end that racism. This was part of the Mechanics Institute series, Black Lives in Film. And I had the pleasure of hosting the first film in that series for the summer of 2020. And I invite you now to close your eyes, tune your ears to what is a conversation and interaction and dialogue with a predominantly white audience over Zoom. I think you'll find this to be quite interesting. So without further ado, uninterrupted, my Zoom chat as part of the series of the Mechanics Institute, Black Lives in Film, August 7th, 2020. I am not your Negro.
And lastly, although you are all muted, please join me in a warm welcome for our guest host, Omar Moore. See all the, you can't hear him, but see all the applause, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Matthew, thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you very much, Laura Shepard. Thank you very much, Pam Troy. Thank you very much, Michael Fox as well, and to everybody at the Mechanics Institute. And thank you, everyone, who is on this call tonight as part of the Cinema Lit series, Black Lives on Film. I thank you very much for your participation. To those of you who have done this many times before, and for those of you who are brand new, thank you very much indeed for being here. Now, I want to talk about this movie, but I also want to offer a little bit of political and historical context outside of this great, important documentary that you have watched. And for me, it's very important to do this. And it would be kind of not wise of me to not do this. So I want to just say that all lives do not matter unless Black lives also matter as well. And I think that is part of this whole conversation. And it's important because this film is a document about Black lives and about Black lives mattering. And this film documents that and documents a number of other things that I want to get into in the next 10, 15 minutes or so. So with your kind indulgence, I am going to talk about this one a bit more. And it's going to be slightly different from the audio commentary that is available. James Baldwin was born on August the 2nd. Now, August is a very important month in American history. And on August the 6th, which was yesterday, the Voting Rights Act was passed, signed by LBJ. Also in the month of August, we had on August the 23rd, the 100th year of this, actually, of the right to vote for women, particularly white women, because in the suffrage movement, we had Black women who were pushed aside by white women in that movement, and those Black women had to fight for another 45 years before they would actually officially get the right to vote. We also had Emmett Till in August of 1955 being brutally murdered and tortured. And we had the March on Washington in August of 1963, August the 28th, 1963, a march that James Baldwin, John Lewis, Sidney Poitier, and others participated in, among many others. So that's the historical context that I want to gently orient you to as I start to talk about this film. Now, Raoul Peck has put together a fine work, and I want to add that there are some important companion works that I think that you should familiarize yourself in addition to this film. One of them is the 1963 documentary, Take This Hammer. That is a documentary that is 59 minutes long. It's known as the director's cut. It is available online, and I'm going to put a link to this on my social media page on Twitter at The Popcorn Reel, and I'm sure there will be other places where you can access this. But I do want to say that the actual importance of mentioning Take This Hammer is because it deals with San Francisco and James Baldwin touring in San Francisco. And touring in San Francisco and talking to Black people there about how they felt about living in San Francisco. Very important documentary. It was actually cut by 13 minutes originally because there were Black men speaking about the Nation of Islam, and that was considered something that the film networks the TV networks didn't want to show. There's also Ethnic Notions, which for those of you who are familiar with the conversation here, is available on Canopy. That's available to watch. Ethnic Notions, a very important film. There's also Bamboozled, a film by Spike Lee, very important film about Black imagery. And there are a number of other movies. So let's get to this particular film. James Baldwin begins with this divided frame of mind. He's writing to his literary agent, Jay Acton, and he's talking about writing this proposal for this 30-page manuscript entitled Remember This House, and he's writing it in a divided frame of mind. And what I find interesting about that, and what that evokes for me as a Black man, is the W.E.B. Du Bois book, The Souls of Black Folk, from 1903, the divided Black consciousness, the dual consciousness that Du Bois spoke about. And I find it interesting that James Baldwin spoke about that at the beginning of this documentary. The other thing I want to mention is that there are at least, speaking of divided consciousness, there are at least 2 or 3 iterations of James Baldwin running through this film. There are at least 2 or 3 characterizations of him. He's a narrator, he is an active participant, and he's also an observer. And I find that that's represented very well in archival footage, and I think it's done in a very prophetic and really very effective way, I should say. This film deals with reality and lies. This film deals with a house called the United States of America. This film deals with that house being divided. Lincoln once said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And what this film shows us is how divided that house remains. It shows us the house that was built by black people on stolen land, Native American land, and how those black people for 300 years had not been given payment for any of that. James Baldwin talks about this in the film. The soil, my father's soil, blood, sweat, and tears. My father's blood, sweat, and tears are in that soil, that house. And this is about race and racism, but it's also about responsibility. This film talks about that. James Baldwin lays down a challenge to white people in America. And he calls this a mentality. This challenge is about changing the mentality of the average white person in the country. And I mentioned this thing about suffrage because I want to tie this in about the suffrage movement and the black women who were a part of that and who, quite frankly, were cast out of that. Some of them may have got the right to vote, but many black women did not. And I think what's really important.
I'm gonna have to come back into the Omar, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay. We thought we lost you for a minute.
There was a freeze there.
Oh dear. Oh my gosh, I was talking all this thing. Well,
I'm so sorry.
That's totally okay.
You had just said that it was about changing the attitude of white people, or changing the way their outlook.
Yes, and the mentality, and this is the thing that's very important, because I use the thing about suffrage to tie into something that goes on today on social media, for example, where I've observed some white women in particular who say that black women have to save them. Black women have to save the country because the elections are coming up and we know that black women are very reliable at what they do and they vote in a certain way. We need them to save the country. And what James Baldwin is asking the average white person is, when will you look at yourselves and try to save this country and save yourselves? That's the question he poses at the very end of this particular film. So that's one thing I want to talk about. And then finally, what I want to get to is this notion of heroes and villains. This notion of people like Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and people like Dr. King, Coretta Scott King, as heroes grounded in a real reality for black people. And people like Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier, and how they are used or not used in cinema. And how people like John Wayne are used in cinema. And how John Wayne, is pointed out in the film, is in no hurry to grow up as he's massacring Native Americans. And Donald Trump is in no hurry to grow up as people are being caged on the border. And as 160,000 people are no longer with us. So I say this from a political standpoint, but a historical continuum to tie in with these events. And the cinema that is used in this film is both indicting and instructive. And it reflects the worldview in which we live. It reflects the choices that we make. It reflects on how we feel about this divided country and this divided house that we are in. And so in closing, what I'd like to finish with is the important notion of what identity is and how we tie to it. And this film is really very good for that. James Baldwin talks about the connections he has in Harlem, and he uses passages from Go Tell It on the Mountain in this film. The connections he has to his community, to his neighborhood, to his environment, the people who nurtured him, the people who made him grow. And then he asked, what is that connection for white people? How do they connect to that in this country? And also, finally, the notion of heroes, again, on white political figures like RFK, who is mythologized, quite frankly, as is JFK, in the culture. Not to say that they didn't have important things that they did, the Cuban Missile Crisis, other things that were important, but these figures, in some degree, as is so expertly done in this film, have been mythologized as heroes to such a degree, even though RFK did eventually get right the idea that there was going to be a black person who was going to become president. And James Baldwin got a few things wrong in that respect. So there's a lot to think about. I can't possibly go into some of the other deeper things that I really wanted to get into. I would really love to talk even more cinematically about some of the way these images are put together and how that ties in. But out of respect for time and respect for everybody in the audience, because there's lots of you who have thoughts, ideas, feelings, and it would be really great if we all get to share them. I really look forward to hearing what people have to say about the film, how they felt, did it make them comfortable, uncomfortable, whatever the question may be, whatever questions you have for me, what other comments you may have. Please, 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 I am here to listen. Obviously, we're all here to listen to each other and do so respectfully as well. So thank you so much, very much, for your indulgence and your time as I spoke here. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have the first question is from Keasley Jones. Keasley, can you unmute yourself?
Okay, there we go. Thank you for your commentary about the film. It was very interesting. And this was the second time that I saw this film, and I just find it incredibly brilliant in so many ways and very impactful. It's just so full of imagery from all through the culture during the time of James Baldwin experience, both when he was here and when he was in Europe. And it's just really amazing to me how all of these images were pulled together in order to form like a collage or a mosaic of what was the primary message of the film, which is really, I think, as you said, really about, what are white people really going to do here to kind of get our shit together to do what needs to be done to fix the what we have here right now. The one thing that I did want to say is I thought that it was a very, very intimate film in that it had so much of an intimacy of James Baldwin, and it just felt like he was, and there's just the way he described these moments and the way the film showed imagery of the sky and the trees and his description of, driving with the top down, and you just felt like you were right there in his life experiencing these very, very powerful things. So I think that was maybe a part of what made it so strong. It was just how intimate it was. And that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. I appreciate what you had to say, and thank you for your comment. Much appreciated. I don't know if you want me to respond to that necessarily, but I appreciate what you had to say. I totally agree with you how evocative and personal and intimate this movie is. It reads like a diary because it really was in a way, but it is a very personal film, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Okay, Trish Gorman.
Yes, I finished seeing this movie 5 minutes before we went online here, and so my mind is still completely blown. And my first observation is that it was almost like poetry is to narrative. In other words, an intellectual description of racism of the last 100 years or 400 years could not be as powerful as something so, like Keasley said, mosaic. I mean, it was so impactful and just directly to your heart. I mean, of course, your mind is engaged, but it was so deep. And one thing that struck me is that so often on television these days, as we listen to political commentary, and all these horrific things are going on, and the commentators say, "This isn't America. This isn't America," they say on TV. And if you will indulge me to read a little, I actually had to play it back to get the words. I found it so impactful in the film. They were showing the Jerry Springer show and all the commercials, the game show stuff. And he says, to watch the TV screen, you learn frightening things about the American sense of reality. We are cruelly trapped between what we'd like to be and what we actually are. And we cannot possibly become what we would like to be until we're willing to ask ourselves just why the lives we lead on this continent are so tame, so ugly, and so empty. And I don't know, that was just there were so many moving parts, but that particularly struck me as this idea that I recognized myself doing it, creating a fantasy version of the America that I love, that I believe in, that I study our history, and I want it to be so great. And then when we don't live up to it, it's so painful.
I appreciate your comment. Thank you so very much. And again, there's so many things to say about the film, and I mean, even in the short time I had, that's one of the things I didn't get to, and I wanted to get to that. The reality and the fantasy, and I think I did allude to the reality and fantasy and the lies and the truth that hit up against each other. But the denial that you are touching upon here, the denial that we are living in, the denial that many white people specifically are still living in. There are some white people who are well aware and well awake, but there's still far too many white people who are not. And I think that line hit you in a very deep way because of a lot of those things, because of those truths. You may know people who still live in this denial. There may be people on this Zoom call that still may live in a denial world. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know you personally.
I would say I'm one of them with this onion that keeps peeling, taking layer upon layer upon layer off. I'm not. I have been in my own dream of this country, and I've seen some things, but I don't think I saw it with my eyes wide open.
I completely hear you 100%. I'll add one thing. This should be, and I hope that, and some people may say it or not in their comments, and I'm not going to be too much longer with this, but I hope this film made people uncomfortable. I really do. Particularly white audience members, because this film to me is a wake-up call. There's lots of other wake-up calls that have gone on since this movie, but this is a really important film, and if people feel uncomfortable, I would love to hear them, if they want to share that, I would love to hear them do that, because that's the first step. We have to be uncomfortable to want to change this reality or this lie or this brutal truth that we are living in. So I thank you for your comment. Really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Jackie Davis Martin?
Yes. Hi. Omar, I wanted to comment on your word divisiveness in the film. I think I felt it, and it was most powerful in the way the film was put together. And there was so many times when there would be our superficial thought about what America is, and then juxtaposed with the reality. And I'll just cite two examples in particular. And that is, there was the beating of the police on these black men. At the same time, these children's voices were singing, "Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel?" And I mean, there was so much of that. And the other one that really affected me was some kind of nonsense about how wonderful America is. Made in 1960, the images of the Statue of Liberty and all these wonderful things. And the wonderfulness of that presentation went on in words while we went to the brutality of what was happening in 1965. And that was done over and over again. And one cannot help but be jarred, from this mythical idea we all have versus the reality people are living through. I thought that was beautifully executed. And it certainly is what drove lots home to me.
Thank you so much for your comment and your feelings and thoughts about this. And yeah, there is that ever-present smashing of these two worlds together, the lie and the truth. It's just relentless, the fantasy and the truth. Even the stuff with Doris Day, the grotesque appeals to innocence. Doris Day and Gary Cooper, right? High Noon, and
well, that was followed by a lynching.
Yeah,
I mean, she was in that pearl dress, and then yes, that was just so powerful.
Yeah, and thank you. I really do appreciate what you had to say, and I respect everybody's thoughts and opinions. We all should be respecting each other, and I thank you for what you had to say tonight. Thank you.
Okay.
Ying Ying Wu. Okay, hi. Hi, Omar. Thanks for your comments, and hi, everybody. I really enjoyed seeing this film for the second time. I felt it was very powerful and moving, but it was also very disturbing. But what really struck me about it was how it took a very personal. It really took James Baldwin's personal point of view, his friendship with these icons of the Black movement, that he was going to write about. But then he, talks about these very intimate moments, like where he was when they were assassinated and stuff like that. That was just so powerful. Yeah, and the thing is, it was very interesting that Raoul Peck used these images from popular American culture to show the complete dissonance. The thing is, I think people, you really have to think about it. Just in the recent months, with all the Black Lives Matters protests and stuff like that, I personally, have started thinking about all these things, these situations that I took for granted, even here, myself personally living in San Francisco on Potrero Hill, why is it that, most of the Black people, almost all of them, are living in the projects on the other side from where I live, The thing is, we don't think about that, but in fact, this is the living situation in our cities are so segregated, we just take it for granted. I lived in Paris too, and it wasn't that segregated, not as segregated as it is here, but I didn't really think about it until I, came back and started thinking about this recently, and all these things that are just, I've just been reading these things lately, these women in the New York Times, these Black women who were doing the scrapbooking, and they had formed some kind of group on social media, and then these white women joined, but then when they found out it was a group of Black women, they all went and left and formed their own separate group, that kind of thing. It's just, and this other thing I read in the New York Times the other day, an obituary yesterday about a woman who died who was a part of a female band in the 40s. Well, she was very light-skinned, and she was in an orphanage for white kids, but then she was in a school, I don't know, for white kids, and then her adopted father came to pick her up, and he was Black, and blew her cover, as it were. This kind of stuff is going on all the time, so that, it's just this kind of taking, he brings that out in this film, He touches on all these things, these people that are trying to pass for white because they know their lives are going to be so much easier if they can pass as white, but they have to sacrifice something of themselves. They have to sacrifice their families, in order to do that. There's some new novel that came out about two sisters, one who was very white-skinned, I haven't read it yet, who moved to LA, and passed as white, all this kind of stuff. So you have to ask yourself, what kind of reality, he's trying to bring out that reality. And I think he did a really, really great job. I mean, it's just so much food for thought and so timely too, well, this film's like 4 years old, but it's a film that really haunts me. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much for what you've just said. I do really respect, value, and appreciate what you've just said. And I just wanted to say, to briefly respond, this is what I see as not just obvious racism, but also a systemic, what I call systemic whiteness, which is an attitude. It's not really a race, it's an attitude. And it's an attitude that is woven into the systemic fabric of this country, so that people are making the choices that you have just expressed, that you have read about, making these really difficult choices that they don't have to. If we are really truly the human race, then we should all be treated as such. And there is one film I should mention. It's a documentary. I'm not going to say the last word of it. I'll just say it's called Baldwin's N-Word. That's available on YouTube. 1969, James Baldwin, and pieces of it are excerpted in the film, and Dick Gregory. And they talk about some of the issues you've mentioned, and the thing I'm pointing out about whiteness being a mentality, about blackness being an attitude, whiteness being an attitude, and not really about this issue of race. Race is really not it's an artificial thing. It's really about an attitude that separates people for power and control and makes these painful choices that you pointed out. So thank you very much for your comments.
Michelle Anderson.
Hi. Well, I guess you've seen me being sort of emotive, but basically, the previous speaker has paved the way for me to just go on and on and on, which I will try not to do. But on one side of my family, we come from a long line of very light-skinned black people, and so I'm very familiar with relatives passing for white, or if they were minding their own business. They were unmasked and they got fired from their jobs. They lost their houses, blah, blah, blah. And one of my uncles got so tired of being fired from his jobs, he moved to LA in 1945, passed for white, and became very successful as a white man. And he was written up in Time with a picture in 1951. So with all due respect to our moderator, being white is more than an attitude. You have to sort of look the part, because we had this one drop of blood thing, which we got from the days of slavery. And so, I grew up hearing about how bad things were back in the old days, even if you were part of the light-skinned elite, the talented 10, according to Du Bois. But it's just that this film brought back the days of my early childhood, where things were changing really rapidly. And before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I read in Shed Ebony about people being killed, lynched, etc., and how awful things were in the Jim Crow South. I mean, they weren't a lot. Well, they were better in the Northeast, but that's just relative. So this film really took me back to, how things really changed so drastically between 1961 and 1964. And one of my class took a trip down to the Florida Keys in 1968 during that time of transition, and there were just 4 black kids out of 45 kids. And I didn't find out until recently how the chaperones had to deal with, being turned down from restaurants or not being able to stay in places because we had a mixed group. And we were on our way back to Buffalo, that's where I'm from, in 1968, and that was when King was killed. And we didn't hear until a few years back that the school bus was stopped because there was a group of whites with baseball bats or whatever going from vehicle to vehicle trying to find black people to beat up. So, so this takes me back to the
brutality of those years, and also how black folks were not looked at as really fully human. And I could really see why people in my parents' generations did pass, because the opportunities were so limited and life was just hell. And even if you didn't try to pass, it was just, So, so this film really, I thought, was excellent. And, it just shows how far we've come. And things aren't perfect, but things could never be as bad as when I was a kid and was too young to go to the March on Washington. So that is my... Bye.
Thank you very much for your comments and your views. I respect everything you had to say. Thank you so much. There's nothing really to add to what you've said. You're speaking about your experiences. And so thank you very much for what you had to say. I appreciate it.
Barbara Massey. Barbara? Are you there? You need to unmute yourself.
Gotcha. Sorry. I just wanted to give you my reaction to the movie. I found it profoundly articulate and profoundly painful, because it brings up all the memories that I've had of seeing racism in practice. And I really love the movie because it is so articulate, so wonderful in terms of telling people how it is that you can feel when you feel discriminated against, and to tell it in a way that a lot of people understand, but maybe not everyone. Basically.
Thank you so much for your comments and what you had to say. Really respect you and what you've had to say tonight. So thank you very much.
Are you calling on me? Okay, I can see your mouth flip, but I can't hear you. Omar, I'm curious, can you please tell us a little bit more about how the film got made? Clearly, a lot of this film was, shot a long time ago, and it looks like, tell us more about the Belgians and the French who were involved in this. Just give a background, how it was made.
Yeah, and I can tell you, to my limited knowledge of it, actually, because I can only tell you that this was a years-long project. And the Belgians, I think the French too, I'm not sure, were also involved. I'm not 100% sure. This had been a project that had been going on for many years, almost after, Baldwin passed away, really, which he passed away in 1987. And essentially, from what I can tell you about what I know about it, it is a project that Raoul Peck wanted. There were other directors, I think, that were looking at it, but Peck was the one who ended up getting it. That much I do know, as far as I know. I can also say that this film has really been cobbled together, and I can only tell you really more about the way the film was constructed rather than the way the film was produced. Is that this was a film full of archival footage, taken from such works as Take This Hammer, from Go Tell It on the Mountain, from No Name on the Street, from various Baldwin works, in addition to the manuscript. I mean, the way the film is constructed, you're believing that this is literally only the 30 pages of Remember This House, when in fact, if you look at the entire film, the film is also constructed from such books as The Devil Finds Work, which is an excellent Baldwin book that's not often talked about film criticism. This is Baldwin as film critic. And he talks about all of these movies that you see, and this film took part of itself from The Devil Finds Work. And I urge everybody on this call, and I'm going to put up a whole list on my social media pages of important books, films and other things related to what we've been talking about tonight. The Devil Finds Work. He talks about Dance Fools Dance, which you see in the opening few minutes. He talks about all of these films and goes into detail on the social, political, and historical implications and the race implications of each and every one of them. So I do urge you to find The Devil Finds Work. It's an excellent book. And that's pretty much all I can tell you about how things are constructed and everything like that. I must be honest with you, beyond the basics about the Belgians being involved and Raoul Peck being involved, I have not, to be quite frank, researched anything more about the film other than the themes and the content. So I will be honest with you and say that. Thank you very much for your question.
Michelle Anderson. Okay. This is my friend Judy.
Hello, Judy.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, and yourself?
Oh, okay. Well,
Very good.
first of all, I have to admit that I did not get to see the film, but I
Okay.
plan to because my computer guy came in and took away my computer.
Oh,
Because it has to be updated. I want to go back to an experience I had in 6th grade. Obviously, I'm not black, but I am Jewish. And I came out of the school. It's a normal day. And I walked out, and there was a gang of kids saying, "You are Jewish when you killed Christ." And I went home for dinner, and I quietly asked my parents, as all the forks dropped on the dinner table, "Did we kill Christ? Mom, Dad, what is this?" But what I'm really after are your views, be it Jewish, be it black. Discrimination for Jews has been long happening, and there's a sunrise in it now. I don't see it stopping, as I don't see discrimination against blacks. And so I guess my question is, what do you think has to take place for this to stop? And for blacks, for Jews, I mean, they've been going on about the same time. So that's it. That's my question.
Judy, thank you very much for your question, and I respect your question. I respect you. Thank you for your question, and I will try to answer as best as I can. Anti-Semitism is clearly very much here. It's never really left at all. I did a podcast episode on the Politicrat podcast, which I do on a daily basis, and I've done a couple of episodes talking about anti-Semitism and outlining what has been going on and also what we need to do to stop it. And obviously, one of the things we need to do is have better education about not only Jewish people and about the things that they have gone through in society and in the world, but also about what we do and what this country has done to contribute to this anti-Semitism, which is still rife in France. It's still rife in a number of places all over the world. We need education. I know that sounds perhaps like a bland answer, but that's the first step. We need to start seeing each other as human beings. We need to start respecting each other's humanity. We need to start being more empathetic towards each other. And we also need to be able to listen to each other. Even when we disagree, we have to do that. And I think things like that are crucial ingredients, among others, in this drive towards eradicating anti-Semitism and eradicating all forms of racism, especially anti-black racism that continues and has never left either. So these are two things that we must not only just focus on, but we must be dedicated to. We cannot pay lip service to these things. And that's why I said that all lives do not matter unless black lives matter as well. And that's all black lives, all lives. Because in this human family, we know that not every life does matter right now. So to your question, anti-Semitism is something that we have to, on a personal level, if we note and we see people saying anti-Semitic things, we've seen this right now in politics where the candidate for Senate down in Georgia, John Ossoff, a Jewish man who's running for Senate in Georgia, had a anti-Semitic ad put out on him by the Republican Senator David Perdue, in which John Ossoff's nose is enlarged. I mean, that's a quote-unquote classic anti-Semitic trope. So what we need is to call that out. If you see something that's anti-Semitic going on around you, confront the person. Call it out. If you see something racist going on right in front of you, do not be silent. If someone tells a joke that is racist in your workplace, speak up. Same thing in anti-Semitism. Speak up. Do not laugh uncomfortably and say nothing. Those are some of the things that we can do to start to fight back and push back and let people know that anti-Semitism and racism and anti-black racism and any other kind of ism is not welcome and is not going to be allowed here. So thank you for your question. Very important one, Judy. Thank you.
You have anything else
Yeah.
to say?
Yeah.
Talk.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for your answer. And I just wanted to say, I was walking along the street, and this was last week or probably longer, but this guy comes up behind my back, points to me, you're Jewish, you have a long big nose.
What?
And he went so fast, I was so shocked, and so was my friend, I couldn't do anything. But thank you for your answers, and it kind of follows along what our rabbi has been saying, etc.
Right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Woo.
What? Say one other thing about the film. This scene that he describes of going out with a white woman friend in New York, and they're having to go out separately and not be walking together, to just meet on the subway platform in New York City because it was dangerous for him and for her to be seen together whenever this was. I don't know, it must have been, in the 50s or whenever it was. But, that's the kind of thing. When he talks about this, it was in an article that he wrote that was, I saw that was republished in the New Yorker recently. It was called A Letter from a Region in My Mind. But anyway, so this whole thing about the danger of, for black and white, of being seen together like that, and all the implications that has. Well, the thing is, this country, I basically think there's this whole concept of whiteness that has been formed because in the 19th century, certain classifications of white people were, discriminated against, like Italians, like Jews, like Irish, and so forth. But now it's just a concept of whiteness, that if you're white, then you're all right. But, if you're not white, well, then you are the other. And I think that's what this film he's talking about, and I feel like, anyway, so that's what I wanted to say. It's a concept, but it's changed. And that's an idea that we have to change because the concept of whiteness is just a concept, just like what Omar was saying, and until we take the power away from that concept, then we're not going to be able to function as a country. We seem less and less able to function as a country because of this sort of twisted idea. So
thank you very much for that. You echoed exactly some of the points I was making earlier, and so thank you very much for your comment, and I respect what you had to say. Thank you very much.
Michael Fox.
I'm actually as follows exactly, but I'm thinking about one of the excerpts of Baldwin speaking at some elite Ivy League university, presumably a private university where everybody in the room would have come from well-off families. That's my assumption there. And the last time they cut back to him speaking there, Peck shows him concluding his speech and the room exploding in applause. And I had this whole multitude of reactions to the applause. And the first, of course, was the generosity of the applause. He's I wouldn't say he's in enemy territory, but he's probably the only black guy in the room. And so first of all, what they're saying is your ideas are welcome here. We embrace your ideas. And of course, as a white person, there's a little bit of self-satisfaction around that. Like, the white people get Baldwin, that's great. But we're also 50 years down the road here, or 40, whatever it is, 40 years down the road, and there's certainly been some changes, but it's still incumbent on us white people to pick up the ball. So there's this, so I just had this contradictory range of emotions, you know what I mean, of satisfaction and then discomfort at the same time. You know, like my complacency being revealed to me in the same moment, in a way.
I appreciate that, Michael. Thank you. It's good to see you. Thank you very much for your comment. And I just want to say, Michael, that the scene you're speaking of is the 1965 debate at Cambridge University in Cambridge, England, where James Baldwin is debating William F. Buckley. And you can actually see the entirety of that debate on YouTube as well for anybody who is interested in doing so. I note your comment about feeling uncomfortable as a white person watching a majority white crowd kind of appraise and applaud Baldwin. And he won the debate, for the record. I'm sure people know. And that's not really a big spoiler alert. But the dissonance or the kind of fantasy reality of that, because this whole movie is about illusion and reality, lies and truth. And you point that out well with what you've just said about seeing mostly white men applauding James Baldwin and then knowing that we're living in an age where, you know, white people by and large still have not looked at themselves, looked at their relationship to history, examined what history is and what their place really is in it, particularly here in the United States, and then looked at themselves, excavated themselves, and then used what they get out of that to try and save themselves and America. Because this isn't about white people saving black people. Even though all the movies that we see have these benevolent white figures, right? These white progressive figures. You know, Mississippi Burning in 1988 with the two white FBI agents who cared so much about black people in Mississippi in 1964. We know that's all nonsense. Anybody who's a student of history knows that is mythology. That is designed to make, as James Baldwin points out in the film, white liberals downtown feel more comfortable with themselves. So I just want to thank you for pointing that out and being honest and really open about your feelings about this, Michael. So thank you very much for your comments.
Matthew.
Omar, as I was taking notes on the film, I wrote down several quotes, but one that I think is really salient to exactly what you were just, Michael, and others have talked about. And at one point he says, the use of entertainment is hard to distinguish from the use of narcotics. And as a movie person, what I find offensive is that when Hollywood depicts racism, it is usually so virulent and so over the top that it feels as though, and I think Mississippi Burning is an example of that, or some elements of that. What then happens, I think, in the minds of well-intended white liberals is, I'm not that, therefore I'm not part of the problem. Therefore, I don't really need to step up because I'm living my life. I vote properly. I'm aware. I'm not racist. So, we'll let the folks who are going to specialize in that take care of it. But what I would like to see in film more often is a more subtle and insidious form of racism, or at least the damage or the damage of apathy, the damage of complacency, and how crippling that is to making real progress in America. I'm reminded of a film that I'm reminded of Gentleman's Agreement. It's a film about anti-Semitism that came out in the late 40s. And one of the things that I really admire about this film is that it does show, again, the theme here is anti-Semitism. It's not racism against blacks, but in Gentleman's Agreement, it's, country club white people who have this sort of insidious attitude against Jewish people that you're actually in the film becoming sympathetic towards certain characters, and then they sort of trip up and reveal that they too carry this with them. That's the kind of portrayals of white people with regard to race I would love to see more of in American film. That's all.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt, for that. I appreciate it. I would say one thing. Usually in response, or just to add something, usually white people who are racist on film are usually depicted, as you point out, as these extreme racists, or they're alcoholic. They're drinking something, and then the truth comes out. That's usually the degree. Now, there are some films, and I can think of one in particular, and I wish that James Baldwin had lived a lot longer than the 63 or 64 years that he did. One film I would have loved him to see is Do the Right Thing. Now, Do the Right Thing shows us some of this. This benevolent white character named Sal, the late Danny Aiello, who shows us his true colors. And I think a film like that, and there are others, but I can't bring them to mind at the moment, are the kinds of films I think that you'd like to see more of, and I think a lot of us would like to see more of, that challenges the white audience member more. That really challenge, because quite frankly, and I'll just say this for 10 more seconds, white people at large have not been really challenged to look within themselves at who they are, what their identity is in relationship to the country they live in, the United States, and their history with it and what their history is to it. Black people are very aware of what that is, right? Black people, that's when I talk about blackness being a consciousness and attitude and whiteness being a mentality. Black people are very conscious of what that is, right? They go through ups and downs, the triumphs, the hardships, the discrimination, the racism. They know what that is. They're in touch with that. A lot of white people, many white people, the vast majority of white people are in denial about that even. So I agree. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And quite frankly, I think you get this when you change the gatekeepers in Hollywood. I think you will get more of those movies too when you change the gatekeepers in Hollywood from those older white men to people who are part of the history that is often left out in the history book. So thank you for your comment.
I'd like to just quickly make a comment. It's one thing that struck me about the film that, if you'll excuse me, did date it, was when he talked about the white middle class. And the white middle class in this film is depicted as secure, is depicted as, the American dream for the white middle class was still in force. And I don't necessarily think that's true anymore. I think that one thing that is happening in this country is that the white middle class is getting scared. And one of the things that, one of the big issues has always been voter suppression. And what happened in 2000, starting in 2000, with the presidential election and the debacle that resulted, was you saw white people, to some extent, being treated the way black people had in their vote being suppressed. And you had counties in Florida that were not predominantly black, but that still, I think in one of the cases was a predominantly Jewish precinct that voted for Pat Buchanan. This was obviously, and that was kind of the beginning of people beginning to realize how much danger just the vote was in. I mean, I worked as a poll watcher in 2004 in New Orleans in a black district, and I was astounded by the level of suppression, and not overt suppression, not some like you have in a movie, some pot-bellied sheriff with a gun showing up. No, it was people's votes, names being removed from the voter polls. It was machines that didn't work. It was people suddenly having brand new laws sprung on them, like if you were an ex-convict, oh no, you can't vote now, or you have to bring up proof that your voting was restored. And that's one thing I think that's happening in this country. And in a perverse way, it gives me some hope. It's like suddenly it's not just, oh well, that's happening to those other people, and that's a bad thing. It's happening to all of us to some extent, and it's not as virulent,
not as deadly, but just that little taste of it is enough to be terrifying. And that's just my take on it.
Really appreciate what you had to say, Pam. I respect what you said. And thank you for saying it. Because voter suppression, long and continuous as it has been for black people in America, is a tool that is also affecting Jewish populations, older Jewish people, young people, younger white people, young people in general, older white people, elderly people of all groups, and certainly the Native Americans, high levels of voter suppression, Asian Americans, high levels of voter suppression as well. So yes, excuse me, there are members of the white community who are being suppressed, their votes. If they're poorer, if they're older, if they are Jewish, if they are of those backgrounds, yes, that does definitely happen. It's prevalent and it continues today. So thank you, and I appreciate your comment.
Okay, Michelle again. Michelle Anderson.
I'll make this short and sweet. I've been friends with a Brit for years, and he thinks that a lot of this is American. So, my question is, how do you think this film would resonate among black Brits or Brits?
Thank you for the question, Michelle. It's a really good question.
I'm sorry to raise Brits, but, hey.
Michelle, thank you so much. I really appreciate you and your questions. I think the film would resonate just as deeply there, quite frankly, amongst a number of people in the Black British community. I also think that James Baldwin, and you may or may not know this, I'm sure you probably do know this, he made numbers of trips to London. He talks about it in the film, but even outside the film, he made at least 2 documentaries in London. And the reception the reception that he got was very positive and a lot of solidarity. I think this film hits a chord in London and all over the UK, simply because the issues are very much the same. And yes, there's talk of more class issues, but there's deeply embedded race issues throughout the UK, always has been, or always, quite frankly, will be. We even look right now at the royal family and look at the way that Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, has been treated. We look back to the 1700s with Queen Sophia Charlotte, who was a black queen, by the way, who nobody likes to talk about.
Back in the old days, back in 78, when they couldn't quite make anything of me because they didn't know what my race was.
Yeah.
Shut up. The Brits are a little bit racist.
The Brit, and that's what I'm getting to. That's what I'm about to get to, is that the Brits are incredibly racist individuals. America does not have a monopoly on this. I promise you that. Growing up in England, I can attest to that. And, of course, it does still continue on. We see it now. We've seen it for hundreds of years. There's a great book, by the way, 2 great books. One of them is called Black Britannia. It's written by Edward Scobie, Scobie. I'll put this in the list of books. Black Britannia, A History of Blacks in Britain, and a wonderful book called The Black Tudors, Tudors, The Black Tudors.
Like Henry VIII?
That kind of Tudors, exactly. The Black Tudors. And it's written by Miranda Kaufman. And again, I'm going to put this list together on my social media page.
Yeah.
So please look, it's on Twitter at the Popcorn Reel. So I'm going to put all this together.
We're kind of being sneaky.
Well, I'm a different face that you've...
Thank you.
Omar. Hi. I'm
Hello.
a different face you've already seen. I'll be quick.
Okay.
What I've thought about is people's sensitivity, and is it going to take people who have experienced prejudice or experienced prejudice because they're black or Jewish or thing to be aware of what's going on, and sensitivity to wake up and say, this is wrong. It was wrong in slavery, it was wrong for anti-Semitism, it was wrong wherever. If it's happening in 2020, 2021, does someone have to experience the persecution, not to the degree of slavery, but prejudice or discrimination, for people to wake up.
Yeah,
Amen.
I appreciate your comment, Judy. And one thing I would add is that I think that, and I think I alluded to this before, but I need to be a bit clearer, is that I think that anybody who's perpetuating this, but in this case, particularly it's on the subject of this movie, the white community has to have a real dialogue with itself. And the conscious people in the white community who have the empathy and the care and the genuine care about the humanity that we have to have a conversation with those white people in their families, in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, in their lives, in their romantic lives. Have that conversation. That's where that conversation really has to be centered. The people who have been the oppressed persons, like whether it's Jewish people, whether in this case, with this film, black people, we've had these conversations. Many of us have fought and died. We've had two Jewish men, for example, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, 1964 in Mississippi, two civil rights workers who died alongside a young black man named James Chaney. We've had so many examples of this, of the people who are being oppressed, people historically, whether it's black people, being continuously dying. And we've had a few white people who have too. Heather Heyer, Summer Taylor, James Reeb, right? Viola Luiso, right? And it will take the conscious white people in the world to have that conversation with those white people they know, who are the ones perpetuating this hate and ignorance. It's going to be painful conversations, but that is what has to happen here to start to transform what's going on. And again, I will say this one more time for people. This is really about white people wanting to free themselves of all of this, because black people cannot be fully free, and this country cannot be fully free unless and until white people are able to free themselves of this hatred, this thing. And that's what Baldwin talks about in this movie, and that's what he's talked about in his books. Someone talked about, I forget who it was, that talked about Letter from the Region of My Mind. That was reproduced from the book The Fire Next Time, which is an extremely important Baldwin work. So, yes, those individuals, white people, have to have that conversation with each other. There has to be a lot of calling out in the white community about this. So thank you very much, Judy, for your question. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for two more questions. I thought Steve had his hand up. Steve Posen? Steve? Oh, okay. Then Keesley. Oh, no, Steve. Steve has his hand back up. Steve, unmute yourself. Come on, Steve.
Okay.
Okay.
About
Yes,
you hear me? About what Michelle and Omar said about Britain, there was a big difference. In Britain, until the dissolution of the empire in the Caribbean and Africa in the 60s, there weren't millions of blacks living in Britain. In America, we cohabited and lived. Black people lived amongst us. Very different thing. In Britain, it was a colonial thing. You made money from the sugar plantations, particularly in Jamaica and Barbados. Those two islands funneled millions and millions of dollars into Britain, but no one hardly ever saw a black, unless you were involved in the trade. I'm just reading Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, and the family, the Bertrams, their money comes from a sugar plantation in Antigua. But no one ever saw it. You never saw the interaction of blacks and Brits until mid-20th century.
I appreciate your comment. Thank you very much. I will say also that these two books that I've mentioned are talked about, Black Britannia and The Black Tudors, really important books that I think will go a long way toward contesting a little bit of what you've said. I mean, I'm not saying that what you're saying is untrue, I mean, there's no question. But Black Britannia and the Black Tudors reveal a centuries-long integration. And those books are really two very important books that I would respectfully recommend to you to take a look at. But thank you for your comment, and I respect what you had to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, Keesley, you had your hand up. Have you decided you don't want to ask the question, or should I move on?
I'll come back around to it. Yeah. One of the things that is raised in the film is the question of why do we being white people, why do we need this concept of the black person that is not of us and is different, and why do we need the other there? And I think that what the film is trying to convey is that our history as a nation is so brutal and so unfair. The nation was built by black people, and the nation was taken from Native American people who were massacred. So there's just this incredible brutality in our history. And I think that perhaps what the film is trying to convey, and that what white people are grappling with, is this: we're in denial, about that. We are in denial about how brutal it really was. Talk about the massacres and the brutal oppression that just exploited people with slavery to build the nation. It's kind of no wonder that all the white people are like, la la la. I don't want to grapple with that. But the film is saying, you have to deal with that. You have to come to terms with that, and that's where I think it's really challenging for a lot of people, is to just get down and get real about that. It's like, we can talk about it being racism and, we shouldn't be bad people and think badly of black people, but it's not just that. It's like, no, it's really owning that history of brutality and the history of the economic exploitation that happened and still happens, and who is in the advantageous position as a result of that. And are we going to be complacent about that, or are we going to try to do something about that? That's I think what the film is trying to convey.
And I really thank you for that comment, and I agree with you 100%. I want to just say also, I respect what you had to say. I want to add this is the central question of the film. In my mind, it's certainly at the end of the movie and other parts of the movie. This is the struggle that white people are going to have to come together and fight and reckon with and deal with. And finally, to say that you really do have this issue. And LBJ talked about this, of the white person needing to have someone to look down upon. In 1960, LBJ spoke about this, that, you can convince a white man to, even if you're conning him, to look down on someone black. I mean, even if you're taking money out of his pocket, as long as he can look down on someone who's black, that gives that white person comfort, that white man comfort. Toni Morrison talked about this. The late, great Toni Morrison. What is a white person without racism? She spoke about that. How do you? What would you be if you take away racism and take that? What are you as a human being? And so the last point I want to make is about, as you point out in your comment, white responsibility. And quite frankly, the lack of it right now. And even in a lot of white people still not wearing masks in the middle of a pandemic, for example, where you've got mostly black and brown people and Asian and Native American people dying from this, and white people, but mostly Latinx and black and native people dying. And is that the reason why still there's a sizable cross-section of some white people not wearing masks? Is it that they are being carefree and irresponsible? Or is it all of those things? And it does run deep. It does run deeper than this idea of race, which is why I'm saying there's this attitude and the mentality. And Baldwin talks about it. Dick Gregory talks about it. There have been people on this call tonight who have talked about it. And so thank you very much for your comment. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
We have one more question, and it's from Rosemary. Rosemary, could you unmute yourself? This is the last question.
Not so much a question. I feel like somebody who's come not finishing their homework. I haven't watched the movie. I'm looking forward to it. I do, because it's in our faces, our comforts with how we've lived our lives. I'm Canadian. I was raised, everyone is equal, but at the same time, left with this comfortable feeling that because I felt that way, that everyone did. So it's been a rude shock to really look deeply at it. And I'm an information seeker. A friend of mine who recently died of ovarian cancer before she died helped create a memorial to the the slaves of Quakers, because people were buried just as colored, with no name saying who they were. And that struck me and her as this terrible thing of a whole lost history. Like, you have no recollection of your ancestors. You have, how do you go back to that? You stole people, you took their culture, you took their language, you treated them as fools when they were forced to work with a new language. I lived in the Netherlands, and I know what it feels like to not know the language and have people talking around you. And you do look like an idiot because you have no clue. So I went from there. I wanted to point out that there are excellent records in the Quaker history and in the Moravians. And when you're reviewing that, the Moravians had everyone write a Lebenslauf, their life's, sorry, my cat keeps trying to help everybody, the Lebenslauf, the life story. And so the slaves of Moravians were educated as well, while still treated as separate. But it's their own words of their journey. And I was thrilled to go to the archive in Bethlehem and read Archibald Monteith's record of his journey. He's very good at describing the whole thing. But then I looked farther. So I used JSTOR and did research looking back. And because the Quakers and the Moravians both believed slavery was wrong, yet they still held slaves. So while I looked at that, you could see that they looked at it as it made a worse person of themselves, and it ruined the enslaved person. But the point was that the people were still a commodity. The Moravians said no individual could own a slave, but they as a collective, their council did. And so I've been through this feeling that you have to look at the root. So the root of these very moral people, or who felt they were moral, still treating people as a commodity and denying them their humanity of having a voice in their predicament, So I'm looking forward to the movie. I wanted to point out that there's so much to read if you go back farther to see that it is unchanged. People are still the same. You feel like you're equal, you're treating people equally, and you still have this gap in your understanding of how slavery ruins those
Absolutely.
People who, racism, slavery ruins you, your completeness as a person. I don't know. So I look forward to the movie. I apologize for not having already seen it. I work really long hours. So.
That's quite all right. Thank you. That's quite all right, though. Thank you very much for your comment. I respect everything you had to say. I think one of the things that you'll find, and not giving away too much, language is critical. How we have these conversations is so important, and the language that we use to define things, how we say things, what we say. I mean, even in something that you've just said, when you said the slaves, the enslaved is what I say. I'm not trying to pick on you, but what I'm saying, I'm doing this to make a point about how we talk colloquially about things like this, is that when you talk about slavery, I talk about enslavement, that process, because if you say enslavement, you are describing the process that happened. Whereas if a person says slaves, it's kind of, not that you're doing this, but when people talk about this, they say, oh, slaves. You're using the so-called enslavement master's language because that's how he looked at those individuals who are human beings, who had a civilization, who had invented great things, who started civilizations. But language is important. I've heard everything you've had to say, and this is not something about what you've said, but it's just, I think my overall point is language is really important. And if I make a mistake, if you or anyone else does, then this is how we can learn from each other in terms of how we communicate about these really important things. And I think I mentioned that New York Times and all these newspapers are the worst culprits for this. And I'm sorry, but I have to say this. The corporate news media, when it talks about race particularly, and when it writes about issues of women being violated, violence against women, the way that the writers describe it, and particularly as well in race, when you say things like racially tinged instead of racist, or, Trump versus something. And it's just, it's this narrative that's completely false and does much more of the damage and disservice that you and I and everybody contributing tonight have been talking about. And it obscures the responsibility of the white community to really do some real deep dives, uncomfortable ones, but they have to be uncomfortable. And we can't live this life and not have some of that. And I'm sorry that you lost your dear friend, and my deepest condolences to you. So know what that is about. That I'm talking about in this other way of, for the planet's sake and for the survival of us all in this country and the world. We all have to wrestle with this, but particularly the white community. But I say thank you so much for your question and your comment and your observation. I look forward to hoping to find out what you think about this film. And I'm on social media at the Popcorn Reel, if you do social media, to let me know what you thought about the film, because it's a terrific movie. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And I'm so angry on everyone's behalf for our, like the Tower of Babel. I'm so angry.
That's okay. Thank you so much.
Everyone, we've got to wrap up. We've got to wrap up now, but I'd really like to thank Omar Moore for a really compelling conversation. And everyone, I really appreciate everyone's contribution to the conversation. Keep the conversation going. This is what we need to do in this country. We need to do it individually. We need to do it socially with our friends, our families, and also vote. Get out your vote early. And let's fight for democracy, and let's fight racism in every single way we can. And I want to thank Matt Kennedy and Pam for putting this together tonight. Thank you, Michael Fox, for being with us tonight. And everyone that's been here. And we have a great series coming up. So join us for the next 3 weeks coming up in August. Omar, come back anytime. We'd love to have you in the audience and contributing if you're free.
Thank you.
And we'll carry on the good fight. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
So everybody unmute, and so we'll say goodbye. And it's so good to see everybody, see the familiar faces.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, Pam.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wear your mask.
Goodbye, Matt. Wear your masks. Yes.
Wear your mask.
Goodbye, Laura.
Okay, be well, everybody. Bye-bye.
I hope you found that conversation to be interesting and enlightening. And I do thank you very much for listening to it. As it happened here on August the 7th, 2020, many people attended, and I'm very thankful to the Mechanics Institute and the good people there for choosing me to guest host their event. Thank you very much for listening, and I can be found on Twitter at the Popcorn REEL. Thank you very much again for your time. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.